This video focuses on the learning approach and specifically classical conditioning. Now, there are three mechanisms of the learning approach: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning theory. Classical conditioning is learning through association. So it involves learning to associate a stimulus, which brings about a certain response, with a new stimulus that brings about the same response. This is learning through association. So when we pair a new stimulus with an existing stimulus response link, we learn to associate the two stimuli and respond similarly to both. Now, at this point, it sounds really complicated, but by the end of the video, it should be a lot clearer. Just note the language used here, because this is the language that you should be talking about when you're writing about classical conditioning in your exam. An example so far then is our mouth waters when we bite into a lemon. Now, if we associate the taste of lemon with the colour yellow, for example, then we may also experience mouth watering at the colour yellow. The taste and the colour have been paired together so that they both create the same conditioned response of salivation. One of the most famous examples of this, which is a key study we're going to look at in a moment, is Pavlov's salivating dogs. Now, for example, if you give a dog food, the dog will salivate. Now, that's an unconditioned stimuli with an unconditioned response, because we haven't taught the dog to do that. That's a naturally occurring response from the dog. Equally, if you ring a bell around a dog, the dog will give you no response, and we call that a neutral stimulus, because at this point, the bell means nothing to the dog. However, if you pair giving the dog that food with the ringing of a bell and you repeat this over and over again, the dog will salivate. Now, at the beginning, the dog is salivating at the food, but if you repeat the pairing of the bell and the food, it will lead to the final phase, which is that the dog will actually salivate to the bell on its own because it associates the bell with the incoming of food. Now, when the dog starts salivating to the bell on its own, we call the bell the conditioned stimulus and the salivation the conditioned response, because it's this bit that has been taught to the dog. Now, again, you may need to be able to define keywords. It's a very popular exam question, often for 2 marks each. So the neutral stimulus is the bell we just talked about. So it's an environmental stimulus that does not naturally produce a response. So, for example, a chair to a human shouldn't really give any natural response or produce any sort of fear or any response at all. The unconditioned stimulus is the stimulus that does produce the natural unlearned behaviour. So, for example, in Pavlov's dogs experiment, that was the food at the beginning, because it produced the natural unlearned behavioural response of the salivation. Equally, a bitter lemon will make your mouth water because that's an unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response then is the salivation to the food, because it's a response that occurs naturally without learning. So, for example, blinking to the sunlight. The conditioned stimulus is the stimulus that's been learned. So, for example, the bell at the end of the study, because it's a stimulus that has now been associated with the unconditioned stimulus so that it produces the same response as the unconditioned stimulus on its own. If we link that to Pavlov's dogs experiment, the conditioned stimulus is the bell because it was paired with the unconditioned stimulus, which was the food. So it then leads to the conditioned response of salivation. And then the conditioned response, as I keep saying, is the salivation at the end of the experiment, because it's the learned behaviour that is shown in response to a learned conditioned stimulus. So, for example, being scared of a dog is because you learnt that it bit you. In summary then, classical conditioning is learning through association. I really suggest you learn that phrase. It's when we pair a new stimulus with an existing stimulus response and we learn to associate the two stimuli and respond similarly to both. Okay, looking at Pavlov's experiment again then, so I've talked you through the scenario. Now, the aim of Pavlov's experiment was to investigate why his experimental dog salivated in response to the sound of footsteps, suggesting that they'd learned that the footsteps was associated with the food. So the procedure was that Pavlov measured the salivation of the dogs when he was presented with the meat powder on its own, and then the presentation of the meat powder with a ticking metronome, and the ticking of the metronome alone. Now, the results were that the dogs initially salivated to the meat powder but not the metronome, and that makes perfect sense because the meat powder is the unconditioned stimulus and the metronome at this point is the neutral stimulus. But after the conditioning phases occurred and they've been associated or paired together, the dogs also salivated to the metronome. So the conclusion was that the dogs acquired an association between the existing response of the salivation and the new stimulus, which was the sound of the metronome. There's a little bit more to classical conditioning that you need to be aware of and particularly be able to define, and these are some of the key terms of reinforcement, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. So the first one's looking at duration, which is how long something will last. Now, the reinforcement here is that the learning link will last as long as the unconditioned stimulus is occasionally represented with the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell. It's the reflex-based unconditioned stimulus which acts as the reinforcer and therefore strengthens the task. So basically, the reinforcement or the association gets stronger the more times it's shown or paired together. Extinction is when the association is no longer there. So when the association is extinguished, so for example, the dog won't salivate to the bell anymore. Now this involves the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus not being paired for a while. Spontaneous recovery is after something has been extinct, so after the association is no longer there, and then after a certain amount of time, it will just suddenly reappear again. And that's what we call spontaneous recovery. So for example, a dog stops salivating at the bell, and then 2 months later, it hears the bell and it starts salivating again because that association comes back. Flexibility then, generalization is another term of classical conditioning which refers to the extending of the original association to include similar stimulus. So for example, if the dog becomes conditioned to salivate to a particular bell, then it might generalize that and start salivating to other bells, maybe the sound of the telephone ringing. In research methods, recall that generalizing from a sample to a whole population means taking something that is true of the same and saying it's true of the whole population. And similarly, generalizing in classical conditioning means that the response that occurs in one instance then occurs in another instance. Discrimination then is the exact opposite of generalization. So this is when the dog will only salivate to the specific bell that it learnt the association with in the first place. So that means that it won't salivate to any other sound. If a researcher does experiments with an animal and asks it to discriminate too closely, then the animal will start to behave in a neurotic way. Think about how classical conditioning will lead on to creating fear responses as well. Now, the next video will look at phobias, where we start to try and explain the acquisition of phobias through classical conditioning. But it's thought that we acquire a fear or a phobic response in the same way that Pavlov conditioned his dogs to salivate at the bell, because we learn to associate a neutral stimulus with the response of fear. So, for example, the neutral stimulus of a spider is then associated with the response of fear, which therefore means that as a result, the spider itself will become a conditioned stimulus, which will lead to the conditioned response of fear.